We're now into 2025, and if you're a Canadian living off your investments, I can almost guarantee that your income has changed. And for some of you, it's changed in a big way. So if this is you and you want to know what's going on, or if you're hoping to retire someday and you hate surprises with your money, stick around because I'm going to get into all the details right here on the Canadian Money Roadmap podcast. Hey, if you're new to the show, I'm Evan Neufeld. I'm a certified financial planner, and I help Canadians retire with confidence. Even if you're not retired, it's important to know how this stuff works because getting surprised with your money and not knowing why things are the way they are is one of the worst things that can happen. It can be stressful. And so knowing what changes can happen with your income every single year, I think is really important. So in this episode, I'm going to cover the main thing that'll change if you're living off your retirement income, so specifically RRSPs, or the second life of an RSP is called a RIF, Registered Retirement Income Fund. And then I'll get into some of the other situations that could have a larger impact and a few other niche things right at the end. So I hope you stick around and enjoy this episode. All right, the first one, if you are withdrawing from your RSP and you've converted it to a RIF already, so again, an RSP is a bucket, a RIF then becomes a leaky bucket. The leaky part of this bucket just means that you can still invest it the same way as your RSP, but every single year you have to take some money out of it. This is a minimum amount that changes every year. The way that the minimums work is based on the account value and your age. And there's a formula that works up until the age of 70. And then after 70, it's just a prescribed amount that doesn't follow a specific formula necessarily. But every year you get older, the percentage amount changes based on you just being a year older. Here's an interesting wrinkle is that the age that it's based on is based on your age at the beginning of the year, not the year that you attain during the calendar year. So many things here in Canada related to taxes and government benefits are based on the age that you attain during the calendar year. But this one for determining your RIF minimums is based on your age at the beginning of the year. Nothing like making things a little bit more complicated, but anyways, that's how this one works. So what changes every year and why does this actually matter? Well, the first thing that's going to change is your portfolio balance. The second thing is your minimum required withdrawal. And the third one is the withholding tax that is required based on that minimum. So let's get into all three of these right now. The first one's a little obvious is your portfolio balance. So if you have your money invested, that means that it's going to fluctuate with whatever the performance of that investment does. So if you're in the stock market and you have a great year, the balance will probably go up over time. If your investments decline in a given year, your portfolio balance will probably be lower compared to the beginning of the year. This all makes intuitive sense. If it's invested, the portfolio balance is going to fluctuate. Then the second thing that's going to change is the minimum withdrawal that's required to come out of the account during that calendar year. Let's get into an example here. So let's say you had a balance in your portfolio of $500,000 on January 1st, and let's say you're 61 years old at the beginning of the year. The way that the formula works is that you divide 1 by 90 minus your age, so 90 minus 61. And in this case, that leads to a minimum withdrawal percentage of 3.448%. And not a penny more. No, they use a pretty specific number here to calculate that. So in this hypothetical case, the minimum withdrawal required is $17,240. Great. You can take out more than that if you want, but that's the minimum that has to come out at some point during the calendar year. Let's tweak the example a little bit, and let's say that next year we had a really good year in the stock market, say, and now the portfolio is worth $520,000, accounting for changes in the performance of the investment, but also accounting for withdrawals. So this was probably a really good year. So up to $520,000, but next year you're a year older. So in this case, the minimum percentage now jumps up to 3.571% at a portfolio balance of $520,000. That means that the minimum withdrawal in this hypothetical again is $18,569. So you can see that it goes up a little bit based on the performance of the portfolio, but also because of your age every year. Now, the third thing that changes is the withholding tax rate based on the minimum. Again, withholding tax is just taxes that you prepay to CRA based on the assumption that you're going to have to pay something, so they just hang on to some of it in advance. Withholding taxes aren't a separate tax. They're not an additional tax. It's a prepayment of taxes you're likely to owe. It might not be enough. It might be too much, but there's an accounting for that when you file your taxes at the end of the year. So how do withholding taxes work on withdrawals from a RIF? Well, this is where things get a little bit complicated. So remember that minimum that we just discussed in the previous point. You do not have to pay withholding taxes on the minimum amount that comes out. All the money is taxable at the end of the year, but they won't withhold any taxes on the minimum. So the only part that has withholding taxes are the amounts above the minimum. Okay, so stick with me on this and we'll try to go through an example. Since you can take out however much you want from a RIF at any time, let's say you're taking out $3,000 a month gross before any withholding taxes or anything like that. $3,000 a month, so $36,000 a year. Let's go back to my first example there where you're 61 and you have a portfolio of 500 grand. That means your minimum is $17,240 in this year. So since the withholding tax rate is just based on amounts above the minimum, we have to subtract the total withdrawal from the minimum amount. So we take 36,000 minus 17,240, and that leaves 18,760 exposed to withholding taxes. I won't get into the specific withholding tax rates, but in this case, 30% withholding tax would be applicable on that 18,760. So it's my understanding that most financial institutions would apply this amount evenly over your elected monthly payments. So it could look like this. Depending on your financial institution, they might do it a little bit differently, but in many cases, it'll probably look like this. So say you have 3,000 gross, meaning 36,000 annually. 18,760 annually is subject to withholding taxes. 30% of that means that 5,628 needs to go to CRA. If we blend that out on a monthly basis, that means $469 per month are withheld from your $3,000. So you request $3,000, some taxes are withheld, and then you end up with $2,531 in your bank account. Again, this might be too much, it might not be enough, but that's what happens. So changes that could happen in any of these respects will affect how much ends up in your bank account every year. So even if your balance magically happens to be exactly the same, but you're a year older, the percentage that you have to take out will go up, and then the withholding tax amount will also change based on that minimum increasing. As you're probably piecing together now, things get a little bit interesting if there are significant moves to the upside or the downside in any given year, and you just need to be on top of what has changed and how much money you actually need. You got to plan for your own taxes and everything that goes along with that. So in the new year, this is a good time to review how much income is actually showing up in your account. And then you can kind of look back and figure out what really happened here and what needs to be done on a go-forward basis to make sure that you don't have a crazy unexpected tax bill or anything like that coming up. Okay, so that's the main thing that's going to happen if you're living off your retirement savings and you had RRSPs before, which the vast majority of Canadians who are retired have. That's what's going to change every single year. Your minimum amount, your portfolio balance, your withholding taxes, and the combination of all of those will affect how much ends up in your bank account every year. But the place where you can see huge swings in how much ends up in your account comes from an account called a LIF. Now, if you have a defined contribution pension plan, so this is the one that the vast majority of people have, a defined benefit plan, in contrast, pays a specific amount of money every month until you die. A defined contribution pension plan essentially just contributes money into a big pot, and you have to withdraw from that pot of money and make your retirement income work. So if you have a defined contribution pension plan and you leave or you retire, you first will move that money over to something called a LIRA, a locked-in retirement account. And in most provinces, not all of them, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec have some wacky rules on this, but the other provinces, you would convert this into something called a LIF, a life income fund. LIF is similar to that leaky bucket, but this one's got a lid on the top. It's got a maximum amount that you can withdraw every year. I'm not going to get into the specifics of this because every province has different rules, but the main thing that changes here is that the maximums can really get skewed. And so for many people, they set their payments to be the maximum amount to come out of the LIF because it's a locked-in account. In many cases, it can be prudent to take as much out of there as possible or unlock as much. Again, depends on your province. But If you have it set to take the maximum amount out of that account as part of your retirement income strategy, if you have a particularly strong year with the investments in that account, it can really skew how much is showing up in your bank account. For someone who's in their late 60s, early 70s, the percentage maximum for most provinces is in the ballpark of 8%. It's 8 point whatever, 7 point whatever. It's in that range. So think of that just as kind of like your high level maximum that you would typically be getting out of this account if you're in that typical retirement age. However, in some provinces, the maximum amount can be overridden by the performance of the investment in the account. And so if your performance ends up being higher in that previous year than your prescribed maximum, the rate of return on the investments then can become the maximum for the next year. So if you had a 20% year in the stock market, which isn't unusual based on a diversified portfolio of global stocks for last year in 2024, that would then become your maximum for 2025. And I won't get into the historical rates of return or anything like that, but say the previous year, your rate of return was 10%, so that was your maximum in the previous year, but now it's 20%, well, your payments in your bank account might actually double then as a result, just based on the maximums that went up. And in many cases, that withdrawal rate is not sustainable. So you'll want to take a look and see why your income jumped by so much if you are someone who is living off the income from a life income fund or a LIF. So unfortunately, this isn't just bonus money that's showing up because you had a good year. What's happening is you're actually withdrawing a larger percentage of your nest egg every month or every year. And so you have to really be careful to make sure that you're not withdrawing at an unsustainable rate based on the fact that you had a good year or a good few years in the stock market. Okay, so that is RIFs and LIFs. Now, another reason that your income is going to change here in January, again, if you're retired and you have government benefits, specifically CPP and OAS, is that both of these benefits are indexed with inflation. So if you're receiving CPP and OAS, those amounts go up with inflation every year. For CPP, it goes up once a year, and that happens here in January. OAS goes up every quarter. The calculations are slightly different on that, of course. But as inflation goes up, those payments will go up too. So here in January, you'll see an increase for both CPP and OAS if you're receiving those. And the interesting thing is that if we ever see deflation when the average price comes down based on the CPI or the consumer price index goes down, your payments from those programs won't decrease. They'll just stay flat. So for retirees, those are the main ways that your income likely changed here in January. So if you have a RIF, a LIF, CPP, or OAS, your income probably changed a little bit. So hopefully this video helped explain a little bit why some of those things might happen. If this episode is valuable for you, maybe share it with a friend who's in a similar situation to help them understand what's going on with their money a little bit more. Thank you so much to all of you who are watching here on YouTube or listening on the podcast player of your choice. I really appreciate each and every one of you for being here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on another episode of the Canadian Money Roadmap.